Young black boy helps millionaire with flat tire. What happened next changed his life forever. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Darren Hayes, a wealthy retired businessman in his early 70s, sat in his sleek black BMW, swiping at his phone in frustration. The Kentucky sun was blazing, the air conditioning barely making a dent in the sweltering heat. Darren was used to life going smoothly. After all, decades of success in the finance world had afforded him every luxury he could want. But here he was, stranded on a quiet back road with a flat tire and no roadside assistance in sight. With no cell signal and no passing cars, Darren tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, annoyance bubbling up. "Great," he muttered, glancing at the deflated tire like it had personally betrayed him. Just as he leaned back in his seat, trying to accept that he might be stuck for a while, a figure emerged on the horizon. It was a boy, maybe 12 or 13, dressed in an old oversized t-shirt and scuffed sneakers that had clearly seen better days. The boy walked with purpose, his silhouette hazy in the afternoon sun. Darren squinted as the boy approached, stopping a few feet from the car. "Got yourself a flat tire, mister?" the boy asked, his tone calm and confident, like he'd done this 100 times. "Yeah," Darren replied, a hint of relief mixing with his irritation. "I'd appreciate some help, but my phone's useless out here." The boy cracked a small smile. "Good thing you ran into me then. My grandpa taught me how to fix flats last summer. Got a spare?" Darren hesitated, caught off guard by the boy's ease and self-assurance. He nodded toward the trunk. "Yeah, it's in there. You sure you're up for this?" Without another word, the boy moved to the trunk and pulled out the spare tire and tools. Kneeling beside the car, he got to work with a quiet efficiency. Darren watched, amazed at how natural the boy seemed, his small hands steady and skilled, his focus unshakable. The minutes stretched out, the boy barely speaking as he worked. Darren felt an odd pang of humility watching him. This kid, with nothing but a faded shirt and dusty sneakers, was showing more resourcefulness and composure than most people Darren had met in his high-powered career. When the job was done, the boy stood, brushing dirt off his knees and flashing a quick, modest smile. "All set," he said simply. Darren reached into his wallet, pulling out a few crisp bills. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help." The boy glanced at the money, then shook his head, raising a hand to refuse. "Thanks, but I don't need it," he said. "Just glad I could help." Before Darren could say another word, the boy turned and started walking back down the road, leaving Darren holding the money in stunned silence. As the boy disappeared into the distance, Darren sat back in his car, the air conditioner still humming. Something about the encounter left him unsettled, moved even. This wasn't something he'd expected from a random stranger, let alone a kid. And yet, in just a few minutes, the boy had done something no amount of money or privilege could ever buy. As Darren drove off, the image of the boy lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. The road stretched out before him, empty and quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. That kid, with his worn-out sneakers and calm determination, had left an impression Darren couldn't explain. He glanced at the empty passenger seat. Normally he'd be thinking about the next golf game or a trip to his favorite steakhouse, but now his mind kept drifting back to the boy. "What kind of kid refuses money?" he muttered, shaking his head. When Darren finally reached home, a sprawling estate with perfectly manicured lawns and a pool that sparkled in the fading sunlight, he didn't feel the usual relief of returning to his haven of luxury. Instead, the place felt cold. He walked through the grand foyer, past the spotless marble floors and expensive art, but it all seemed hollow somehow. That night, Darren sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, the faint tick of the grandfather clock the only sound in the room. The boy's quiet confidence, his refusal to take money, played on a loop in Darren's mind. It wasn't just the act of kindness. It was the way the kid carried himself, no hesitation, no expectation. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the untouched dinner on the side table. How long had it been since someone had helped him without wanting something in return? Darren had spent decades navigating deals, transactions, and power plays, where everything came with a price tag or a favor owed. And yet this kid, this boy from the middle of nowhere had done what no one else had in years, helped just because he could. As the night stretched on, Darren found himself searching for answers in his own reflection. Somewhere along the line, had he forgotten what it felt like to do something simply because it was the right thing to do? For the first time in years, Darren felt something stir, a mix of gratitude and unease. That boy, whoever he was, had reminded Darren of something he hadn't realized he'd lost. By the next morning, Darren couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. The boy had sparked something, a question, a need to know more. Who was he? Where did he come from? And why had such a small act of kindness felt so monumental? Darren found himself back behind the wheel, retracing his route down the same quiet stretch of road where they'd crossed paths. The summer sun blazed high overhead as he scanned the horizon for any sign of the boy. Nothing. He stopped at a gas station, its faded sign barely hanging above the pumps, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of motor oil and old coffee. Darren approached the counter, where an older man in a trucker hat was flipping through a newspaper. "Excuse me," Darren said, clearing his throat. "I'm looking for a kid, maybe 12 or 13. Wears an old t-shirt and sneakers. Helped me with a flat tire yesterday." The man raised an eyebrow. "That's a pretty vague description, pal." "Yeah, I know," Darren replied, running a hand through his silver hair. But he was different, polite, knew his way around a car. The man thought for a moment before shaking his head. "Sorry, can't say I've seen anyone like that." Darren drove on, stopping at diners and small shops, asking anyone who'd listen. Most shrugged. Some pointed him in vague directions that led nowhere. The search felt futile, but Darren couldn't bring himself to give up. Finally, at a tiny roadside cafe with peeling paint and a hand-painted open sign, Darren found a lead. The woman behind the counter, a kind-faced lady with graying hair, tilted her head thoughtfully when he described the boy. "Sounds like you're talking about AJ," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's always helping folks around here. Lives over in Mason Creek with his mama." "Mason Creek?" Darren repeated, the name unfamiliar. She nodded. "It's about an hour out, up near the hills. Not much there, but a few houses and a church. Sweet kid, though, always willing to lend a hand." Darren thanked her, leaving a generous tip before heading back to his car. Mason Creek. The name stuck in his mind as he made the drive. The rolling hills and dense trees grew thicker the farther he went, the scenery changing from sprawling farmland to a quiet, rugged landscape. When he finally arrived, the town was more a scattering of houses than a proper community. The streets were unpaved, the homes modest and weathered. Darren parked near a small general store and asked a passing couple if they knew AJ. "Sure do," the man said with a nod. "They live down that way, in the old house by the creek." Darren followed the dirt road they'd pointed to, his heart beating faster with every turn. When he saw the house, he knew it had to be the right one. It was small and worn, the paint peeling from the siding, but it had a certain charm, a porch with a swing, a yard dotted with wildflowers. Taking a deep breath, Darren stepped out of his car and walked to the front door. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of what to even say, but something pushed him forward, and he knocked. The door creaked open, and a woman in her 40s appeared. Her tired eyes were sharp with curiosity as she sized him up. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "I'm sorry to bother you," Darren began, feeling a little out of place in his tailored slacks and polished shoes. "I think I met your son yesterday, AJ, right? He helped me with a flat tire." Her expression softened instantly, a small smile touching her lips. "That sounds like my AJ," she said. "He's always helping folks. Hold on a second. Let me get him." As she disappeared into the house, Darren found himself glancing around the yard. It wasn't much, a sagging fence, patches of grass struggling to grow, but it was tidy, cared for. It struck him as a place where love mattered more than money. And for the first time in years, Darren felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. AJ appeared a moment later, stepping onto the porch with the same quiet confidence that had struck Darren the day before. He was wiping his hands on his jeans, a smudge of dirt across his cheek. Darren couldn't help but smile. This was the boy who had left such a mark on him with just a few minutes of kindness. "Hey, mister," AJ said casually, his voice steady. "Did you get another flat?" Darren chuckled, shaking his head. No, I'm good. I couldn't stop thinking about what you did yesterday. I wanted to thank you properly." AJ shrugged, leaning against the porch railing like he didn't have a care in the world. "It wasn't a big deal," he said. "Anybody would have done the same." "Not anybody," Darren replied, his tone firm, "and definitely not the way you did it." AJ's mom stepped out onto the porch then, drying her hands with a dish towel. "Come on inside," she said with a welcoming smile. "I just made some lemonade." The inside of the house was humble but warm. The furniture was mismatched and well-worn, but everything was spotless, and the walls were decorated with family photos. Darren's eyes lingered on a crayon drawing stuck to the fridge. AJ's name scrawled in big, uneven letters at the bottom. "Sorry about the mess," AJ's mom said, though Darren couldn't see a speck of dust anywhere. "It's not much, but we make do." "It's lovely," Darren replied honestly, and he meant it. The house had a warmth his sprawling estate lacked, a feeling of life, of connection. As they sat at the small kitchen table, Darren sipped his lemonade, listening as AJ talked about his life. He shared stories about school, about helping his grandpa on odd jobs, and how he dreamed of becoming a mechanic one day. Darren was struck by how hopeful AJ sounded, even though it was clear his family didn't have much. His clothes were hand-me-downs, and the house needed repairs, but AJ carried himself with a sense of pride that couldn't be bought. "I'd just like to help," AJ said with a shrug when Darren asked why he'd stopped to assist a stranger. "If you can make someone's day better, why wouldn't you?" AJ's mom chimed in then, her voice soft but steady. "He's always been like that," she said. "Even when he was little, if he saw someone struggling, he'd do whatever he could to help, even if it was just offering a kind word." Darren found himself leaning back in his chair, humbled by the simplicity of their worldview. It wasn't about what you had or what you could get. It was about what you could give. He glanced around the room again, noticing little details he'd missed before. The patched curtains, the chipped paint on the walls, the faded cushions on the couch. This family wasn't just making do. They were thriving in their own way, with love and resilience at the center of it all. "You've done an amazing job raising him," Darren said to AJ's mom, his voice sincere. "He's got more heart than most people I've met in my entire life." She smiled, a touch of pride in her eyes. "Thank you. It hasn't always been easy, but we've learned to appreciate the small things." Darren nodded, his mind already spinning with ideas. This wasn't just about thanking AJ. It was about honoring the values this family had shown him. And for the first time in years, Darren felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. The drive home from AJ's house was different. The roads felt quieter, the world somehow smaller. Darren's thoughts were anything but. He couldn't stop replaying the moments he'd spent with AJ and his mother. Their kindness, their resilience, and the way they seemed to value things money could never buy. As he pulled into his estate that evening, the gates opening with a mechanical hum, Darren barely noticed the grandeur of his surroundings. His sprawling mansion with its gleaming windows, manicured gardens, and pristine interior suddenly felt empty. Sitting in his living room surrounded by luxury, Darren picked up a picture frame from the mantel. It was an old photo of him as a young boy, standing proudly in front of a small, weathered house. His parents were beside him, their smiles wide despite the modesty of their lives. It hit him like a wave. AJ's home had reminded Darren of his own childhood. His parents had worked tirelessly, not for wealth, but to give him a chance to succeed. Somewhere along the way, Darren had drifted from those roots, caught up in the chase for more money, more influence, more everything. The next morning, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something meaningful. AJ hadn't just fixed his flat tire. He'd opened Darren's eyes to a truth he hadn't seen in years. Darren picked up his phone and started making calls. First to an old friend who owned a construction company, then to a colleague who specialized in home renovations, and then to a contractor he trusted with big projects. By the end of the day, a plan was in motion. Darren didn't just want to fix AJ's house. He wanted to transform it into a place that reflected the love and strength he'd seen there. "This isn't about charity," Darren told one of the contractors on the phone. It's about doing what's right. That kid and his mom, what they've built with so little, it's incredible. They deserve something that matches their heart. The following week, Darren showed up at AJ's house unannounced, clipboard in hand, with a team of workers behind him. AJ and his mom stood on the porch, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief as they saw the trucks pulling into the yard. "What's all this?" AJ's mom asked, her voice trembling as she took in the sight of materials being unloaded: wood, tools, paint, and even new furniture. Darren stepped forward, his smile warm but determined. "You've built a home full of love and kindness," he said. "Now it's my turn to give back. Let me do this for you." AJ's mom blinked, her hands clutching the dish towel she always seemed to have nearby. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Darren interrupted gently, "but I want to. You've already given me something I didn't know I needed. This is just me paying it forward." AJ stood quietly beside his mom, his gaze shifting between Darren and the workers unloading supplies. "You really don't have to do this," he said finally, his voice calm but cautious. Darren knelt slightly, looking AJ directly in the eyes. "I know, but you helped me when you didn't have to, expecting nothing in return. That's rare, AJ, and it's the kind of kindness this world needs more of." AJ nodded slowly, his mom finally letting out a shaky laugh that was part disbelief, part gratitude. "I don't even know what to say," she murmured. "Then don't say anything," Darren replied with a smile. "Just let me show up for you, the way you showed up for me." Over the next few days, Darren stayed hands-on, directing the renovation project. Every time AJ tried to lend a hand, Darren would shoo him off with a grin. "Your job," he'd say, "is to enjoy being a kid for a while." And for the first time in a long time, Darren felt like he wasn't just building a house. He was building something far greater, a bridge back to the person he used to be. AJ tried his best to follow Darren's instructions to just be a kid, but staying on the sidelines wasn't in his nature. Every time he saw the workers measuring wood or mixing cement, his curiosity pulled him closer. Before long, he was hanging around the crew, asking questions and watching their every move. One afternoon, as a burly man named Joe was hammering new planks onto the porch, AJ hovered nearby, his eyes glued to the process. Joe chuckled, looking over his shoulder. "You got a question, kid, or are you just going to stare me down all day?" AJ grinned sheepishly. "How do you get the boards to line up so perfect?" Joe leaned back, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It's all about the measurements," he said, pulling out his tape measure. "You measure twice, cut once. That's the rule." AJ nodded, intrigued. "Can I try?" Joe hesitated for a moment, then handed AJ the tape measure. "All right, but if you mess it up, you're sanding it down yourself," he teased. From that moment, AJ was hooked. Whenever the crew worked, he was right there with them, measuring, asking about tools, and absorbing everything like a sponge. Darren watched from a distance, leaning against his car with a smile tugging at his lips. There was something inspiring about AJ's enthusiasm. His eyes lit up every time he learned something new, and his hands, small but steady, moved with surprising confidence for a kid his age. One day, Darren walked over while AJ was helping Joe align a section of the fence. "You've got a good eye," Darren said, crouching beside them. "Ever thought about doing this for real someday?" AJ looked up, his face serious. "You mean like as a job?" "Why not?" Darren said with a shrug. "You've got the curiosity and the drive. That's half the battle." AJ's grin widened, but he stayed quiet for a moment, his gaze shifting to the tools scattered around him. "I've always liked building stuff," he said finally. "When I was little, I used to make forts out of old crates in the yard, but I never thought about doing it for real." "Well," Joe chimed in, giving AJ a friendly nudge, "you've got the knack for it, kid. And if you stick with it, you could probably teach me a thing or two someday." AJ laughed, but Darren could see the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't just a passing interest. This was the beginning of something bigger. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the workers packed up for the day, Darren noticed AJ sitting on the newly repaired porch, a hammer resting beside him. He walked over and took a seat, the wood creaking slightly under their weight. "You've been busy," Darren said, nodding toward the fence AJ had helped with. AJ shrugged, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "It's fun," he admitted. "I like figuring out how it all works. I didn't think I'd be any good at it, but you are, Darren finished for him, his voice steady. And that's something to be proud of. For the first time, AJ looked up at Darren, his expression thoughtful. Do you think I could really do this? Like, make stuff for people and help them the way you're helping us? Darren placed a hand on AJ's shoulder, his gaze firm. AJ, you've already proven you can make a difference. You just need the tools and the opportunity. And trust me, you'll have both. AJ's smile was quiet, but full of determination. In that moment, Darren realized he wasn't just helping a family rebuild their home. He was helping AJ build a future. The final days of the renovation project felt more like a celebration than construction. The house had gone through a stunning transformation. New siding, a sturdy porch, freshly painted walls, and even a swing set in the backyard that gleamed under the sun. Word had spread quickly through the small town, and neighbors started stopping by, curious to see what all the commotion was about. By the time the last plank was nailed into place, the yard was buzzing with visitors. Some brought baked goods, others carried jars of homemade jam or little trinkets to welcome AJ and his mom into their new home. AJ's mom stood on the porch, her hands clasped together as she surveyed everything, her eyes brimming with emotion. I don't even recognize it, she whispered to Darren, her voice trembling. That's the idea, Darren replied with a warm smile, his hands resting on the new railing. This isn't just a house anymore, it's a home, a place where you can thrive, not just get by. AJ was running around the yard, his energy boundless, as he showed his friends the swing set, the fresh coat of paint in his bedroom, and the new tools Darren had given him as a parting gift. His laughter echoed through the yard, filling the space with life. For Darren, watching AJ's joy was better than any boardroom victory or stock market win he'd ever experienced. It was pure, unfiltered happiness, the kind he hadn't felt in years. As the evening set in, the neighbors gathered on the lawn with folding chairs and drinks in hand, swapping stories and admiring the house. Someone had even brought a small portable speaker, playing soft country tunes that floated through the air. AJ's mom came over to Darren, holding a cup of iced tea she'd made herself. You didn't just fix up a house, she said softly, handing him the drink. You've given us hope. I don't know how we'll ever repay you for that. Darren shook his head, his voice gentle. You've already repaid me 100 times over. Being here, seeing this, it's worth more than anything I could have imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in hues of gold and orange, AJ climbed up onto the porch beside Darren. His face was flushed from running around all day, but his smile hadn't wavered once. Mr. Darren, AJ began, his voice quieter than usual. What's on your mind, kid? Darren asked, glancing down at him. AJ hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the railing. I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us, he said, and I want to do something like that one day. I want to help people too. For a moment, Darren was speechless. He placed a hand on AJ's shoulder, his voice steady and full of pride. AJ, you already are what you did for me, stopping to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. That's what started all of this. Don't ever lose that part of yourself. AJ grinned, his eyes sparkling in the fading light. I won't, he said firmly. As the music played and the yard filled with laughter and conversation, Darren leaned back against the porch railing, a rare sense of peace settling over him. This wasn't just about rebuilding a house or paying back a debt. It was about connection, about showing up for others, and about rediscovering the parts of himself he thought he'd lost. For the first time in years, Darren felt whole. The following morning, Darren lingered outside the house longer than he expected. The renovations were complete, the house transformed, and the celebration from the night before still echoed in his mind. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to drive away. AJ and his mom stood on the porch, waving as he loaded the last of his tools into the back of his car. Darren had been so focused on giving them a fresh start that he hadn't considered how much this place, and these people, had come to mean to him. Are you sure you won't stay for breakfast? AJ's mom called, a warm smile on her face. It's nothing fancy, but we'd love to have you. Darren chuckled, shaking his head. If I stay any longer, you might never get rid of me. AJ grinned from where he sat on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees. That wouldn't be so bad. Darren paused, leaning against the car door. For all the years he'd spent building his empire, he couldn't remember anyone ever saying something like that to him. It was simple, genuine, and it meant more than he could put into words. "I'll be back," Darren promised. "This isn't goodbye." Driving back to his estate, Darren felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite pin down. The mansion felt even emptier now, its towering walls and polished surfaces a stark contrast to the warmth of AJ's home. Darren walked through the halls slowly, his footsteps echoing. For years he had believed success was measured by numbers in a bank account or accolades on a wall. Now those things felt insignificant. As the days passed, Darren couldn't shake the pull to return to Mason Creek. It wasn't just the boy or the house, it was the sense of purpose he'd found there. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Meanwhile, AJ couldn't stop talking about everything he'd learned during the renovation. He spent hours in the yard, tinkering with tools and imagining the things he could build. His mom watched with quiet pride, knowing her son's world had expanded in ways she hadn't thought possible. One afternoon, Darren called AJ's house, his voice lighter than it had been in years. "I've been thinking," he told AJ's mom. "AJ's got a knack for building things, and I know a few people who'd love to help him learn more. Would you be okay if I arranged something for him?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, AJ's mom replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You've already done so much, Darren. We couldn't possibly ask for more." "You're not asking," Darren said firmly. "And this isn't about charity. It's about giving AJ the opportunities he deserves." Within weeks, Darren had set up an apprenticeship for AJ with one of the contractors who had worked on their house. The boy was ecstatic, spending every free moment soaking up knowledge and practicing his skills. Darren visited often, not as a benefactor, but as a friend. Each time he returned to Mason Creek, it felt less like a visit and more like going home. AJ and his mom welcomed him with open arms, and soon Darren found himself sitting at their kitchen table, laughing over simple meals and sharing stories from his past. What had started as a simple act of gratitude had become something much deeper. Darren wasn't just helping AJ and his mom, he was rebuilding himself, one visit at a time. Months passed, and life in Mason Creek took on a rhythm that felt almost magical to Darren. He became a regular visitor at AJ's home, no longer an outsider, but a part of something bigger than himself. Each time he drove up the winding road to their little house, it was like peeling away layers of his old life, the endless meetings, the empty accolades, the shallow connections, and stepping into a world that felt real and alive. AJ thrived under his apprenticeship. He spent his days learning from the contractors Darren had arranged for him, his natural talent blossoming. They showed him how to draft plans, use advanced tools, and think like a builder. By the end of the first month, AJ had started designing small projects on his own, birdhouses, a garden bench for his mom, and even a sturdy new toolbox he proudly showed Darren during one of his visits. "You've got a gift," Darren told him one afternoon as they stood in the backyard, admiring AJ's latest creation. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." AJ grinned, his dusty hands on his hips. "I won't, Mr. Darren, and one day I'm going to build something for you, something big." Darren laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "I think you already have, kid." But it wasn't just AJ who had grown. Darren, too, had found something he hadn't realized he'd been missing for decades, a sense of purpose beyond himself. His visits to Mason Creek became less about fixing the house or mentoring AJ and more about simply being present. Sharing meals, listening to AJ's mom talk about her day, laughing as AJ's friends stopped by to show off their own woodworking projects. It was a kind of fulfillment Darren hadn't felt in years. One crisp fall evening, as the sun set behind the hills and bathed the little house in golden light, Darren stood on the porch with AJ and his mom. The laughter from a neighborhood barbecue drifted through the air, and the hum of crickets filled the spaces in between. AJ leaned against the railing, his face thoughtful. "You know, Mr. Darren," he said quietly, "when I stopped to help you that day, I almost didn't." Darren looked at him surprised. "Really? Why?" AJ shrugged, kicking lightly at the wood beneath his feet. I thought maybe you'd just call for help, or maybe you wouldn't want someone like me messing with your car." Darren's chest tightened. "AJ," he said softly, crouching to meet the boy's gaze, "you didn't just fix my car. You reminded me of what really matters. You gave me something I didn't even know I needed. Never ever doubt the power of kindness." AJ smiled, a quiet pride in his eyes. "I won't." As the sky turned from gold to deep orange, AJ's mom joined them, a cup of tea in hand. "You've done so much for us, Darren," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I hope you know how much it's meant." Darren shook his head, his voice steady but warm. "You've given me more than I could ever repay. This house, this family, it's reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. And for that, I'll always be grateful." That night, as Darren drove back to his estate, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. His mansion no longer felt like a fortress of loneliness but a blank slate, an opportunity to bring the warmth and connection he'd found in Mason Creek into the rest of his life. In the weeks that followed, AJ continued his apprenticeship, his passion for building growing stronger every day. Darren became a fixture in their lives, not as a benefactor, but as a friend, a mentor, and more than anything, a part of their family. And while AJ dreamed of building houses and communities, Darren knew that the greatest thing they'd built together was something intangible yet unshakable, a legacy of kindness and connection. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the renovations or even the mentorship. It was about a boy with worn-out sneakers and a heart full of generosity who stopped to help a stranger, and in doing so, changed both of their lives forever. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness leave the biggest impact.